Hi, everyone, and welcome to Genway Academy podcast. This is where we interview leaders about the past, present, and future of research. I'm Natan, and the co-founder and CEO of Genway AI. We are an AI native platform for human insights. And with that, let's get started. I would like to welcome our first guest for today, JB, Director of Research and Agent Experience at ServiceTitan. Welcome.
Hey, thanks, Nathan. I'm happy to be here today.
Thank you very much for joining us so early. I think it's the early morning hours on your side?
It is. It's still dark out. It's about 7 o'clock here in Portland, Oregon.
Fantastic. We actually don't get as many guests from Portland, Oregon. As you know, I did have a chance to visit and really enjoyed that kind of side of the US. Nevertheless, you have an extremely interesting story, and I want to make sure that we get to as much of it as possible over the next 30, 45 minutes. And with that in mind, I would be curious kind of for you to take us through your educational background and kind of how that shaped your experience and your thoughts about UX research.
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. I have a non-traditional background, but I think a lot of user experience people have a non-traditional background. So I actually, I actually studied theater. I studied theatrical design and production and dramaturgy, which is really the deep research, study, and analysis of playwriting. And I have an MFA in theater. My specialty was in lighting design. So a bit of an eclectic mixture. And that background actually, I was thinking about it this morning. There is a tremendous amount of research involved in mounting a theatrical production. So I think foundationally, I was taught from the very beginning to do research. Of course, the research we're doing now in user and agent experience for product is a bit different than the research that you do in theater, but the principles are the same.
Very interesting. And so you mentioned that many of the researchers have non-traditional background. How common is it for someone to have background in theater?
I don't have a lot of evidence, but there are people involved in user experience who have backgrounds in theater, and Brenda Laurel springs to mind. So Brenda Laurel, pretty well known user experience person, researcher. Actually, they have their MFA in theater from Ohio State University, I think, and we might be generationally very similar. So I don't think it's a huge leap. I think Brenda Laurel got into theater through the game design avenue, which really tracks if your background is in theater. Mine was slightly different. Mine came through more of a transitioning design from paper to digital experience avenue through academic computing. But I think there are probably many people, and yourself even, coming from a theater background.
Indeed, that's correct. We had a chance to talk about it. I always wanted to be an actor up to the point kind of growing in a post-Soviet Union house. And at a certain point, my family emphasized the fact that it's not necessarily going to pay the bills, and I should be making long-term plans if I am to pursue that kind of career. So here we go. I ended up in tech. but definitely miss my experience as an actor and my experience in theater. In that context, I'm very curious to hear kind of whether the decision to become a UX researcher, was that kind of purpose driven? So when when you began studying theater, did you know that this is where you're going to end up? Or was that just an involvement of the events that led you to become a researcher?
Yeah, no, absolutely not. I mean, I had stars in my eyes and visions of designing lighting on Broadway. I wanted to be Jennifer Tipton, but life got in the way of that. And I ended up teaching. So right out of my graduate school program, I took a position at the Interlochen Arts Academy, which is a private boarding school for the performing arts. This was in the very early 90s when everybody was talking about FAME. So it was like a high school for the performing arts. And during that time, there started to be a transition between, designing on paper, standing at a drafting table and drawing on vellum with pencils and straight edges to using basically AutoCAD, using computer-aided design programs. So I think, the genesis of research in this capacity was really watching people shift their mental models from drawing in half or quarter inch scale on a piece of paper to entering into a virtual computer world and drawing that way, which is a very different mindset. And it was fascinating to me to watch that. So the short answer is no.
Okay, so tell us about your first job as a UX researcher, or your first job as a researcher, what you would define kind of within the scope of research. The first time that you realized that, okay, I just shifted from theater to research.
Yeah, well, I didn't really shift from theater to research. I shifted from theater to really designing interactional experiences in the digital world. So I think the first inkling that I had shifted was, I built a website back in the mid 90s for an intro to theater class that I was teaching. And the publisher of the textbook I was using came to visit me to sell me, a bunch more textbooks for this class. And I showed them the website and they asked me if I would be interested in consulting with them to help them with their, websites for theater history. And so I think that was the moment when I really started shifting from, teaching and designing theater to doing something in this realm. And then when I left, I was teaching at West Virginia University. I left for love and moved across the country to Portland, Oregon. And I got my first job in a software company that was, actually, they weren't even a software company. They were a video company and they were making training videos. And they hired me to, as their webmaster, to build their website. And also, while I was there, I started working on a special project to, transition their video training to, CD-ROM training. So that was sort of, my entry into this world.
And I guess it is safe to say that it was pre-AI era. So you actually had to write the HTML code for their website.
Yes. Writing the HTML code, working with Macromedia projects to build the training CDs, and, really kind of doing it all. So I was doing research, but I didn't really think of it as research at the time. It was more like, oh, I need to go out and talk to people who are the subject matter was early childhood educators, right? So I need to go out and I need to visit early childhood education situations and, understand who these educators are, be in the classroom with them, to watch what they do, understand, how proficient they are in maybe using a computer, because that, lots of classrooms didn't even have computers at that time. So I was doing research as part of my job, but I didn't really think of it as research. It was just ingrained in me from, my education in theater, just like, as somebody who's active, right? You might go out and do a lot of research as an actor. You might go out and observe people, to catch their mannerisms or the way they speak. You may even go out and talk to people. When I was a lighting designer, I remember I was designing a production called Hunting Cockroaches. And I actually went out and talked to people who lived in a cockroach infested building in Knoxville, Tennessee, and, asked them what it was like to turn on the lights and, see the cockroaches scatter. That might be a little bit too much for this video.
Mind-blowing. It gives kind of research ops and recruitment an entirely new perspective. Feels like it is slightly different compared to today, where you would have a researcher person and dedicated platforms for recruiting participants. Sounds like a lot of kind of good old-fashioned walking around and just hustling for people to jump on an interview, on an intercept interview.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It was totally guerrilla.
And maybe to put our listeners into perspective, we are talking about the 90s, right? The internet was just emerging, so to speak. To give some context, I believe that in 2006, Facebook was introduced. And I remember that being in high school in Canada, someone sent me their first Facebook invite, and I was invited to the platform. So we're talking almost a decade or maybe more than a decade before that.
Absolutely. We're talking about the 90s.
JB, that's fascinating. And especially the cockroaches story. I can imagine in my face I can imagine in my mind their faces when they have to answer those questions.
Yes.
Since we shifted into that, so I'm curious to hear about the key moments in your professional life that kind of shaped your approach to research. I think for every person, there are those moments that he remembers down the line saying, this was when I took left. That was when I took right. Talk to me a bit about those moments that kind of shaped JB as you are today.
Yeah, I think, that's an interesting question. I think, everything that I've told you up until this point, there was a lot of guerrilla research, and, in the very early 2000s, I think it was probably in 2000, the first information architecture conference happened in Boston. And there was something called WebMonkey. It was kind of a list site. And there was a term that was emerging at that time called, information architecture. And people were calling themselves information architects. And Lou Rosenfeld was kind of leading that. And the first IA summit, Information Architecture Summit, happened in 2000 in Boston. And I went to that summit. And during that time, I met a lot of people for the first time. I met a lot of people who were doing the type of work that I was doing. And I learned a lot about organization and structure, and about how I might take some of this guerrilla type work I was doing and put a little bit of structure and organization around it. So that was really pivotal for me, that, oh, there's a profession around this, and there's something to learn from people who are out there doing this, and that they're doing it like the real way. If there is a real way. So that was one thing, learning to put some structure around things. And then I continued to work as an information architect for a long time. I sort of branded myself that way, and would do research with information architecture in mind. And then I went to work for a company that was involved in very, very early web analytics. So it was a company, one of the first companies that was doing client-side web analytics. So they were actually tracking human behavior on the web, and they hired me as a user experience consultant who could look at some of the behaviors that were happening on the web and then do some qualitative work to explain what was happening, right? And we know that is a research pattern, right? We do quant work, and we look at the volume of behavioral data or attitudinal data. And then oftentimes we do, a deep dive qualitative study to try to understand why or what is going on. Or sometimes we reverse it. Sometimes we do qualitative work, and then we go and we try to size it with quantitative work. So that was another real sort of formative thing. And at that time, that was my first introduction into analytics and actually looking at data in that way. And, connecting the dots between that data and what I was hearing from people when I was talking to them. So I started to learn how to sort of structure, a mixed method study where I'm, organizing my investigation qualitatively with the way maybe we're collecting data on a site. And then, continued to sort of work in that realm. And then I got to go work at Intel as a human factors engineer. I was hired as a human factors engineer, and that was back in the kind of 2005-ish. I think the iPhone hadn't even come out, Facebook wasn't up yet, and so Intel had really expensive, really cool usability labs that were built to look like a living room, and they had these big half mirrored walls, and people would sit behind those walls and watch a researcher, me, conduct a study with people. There were little rooms where we'd put people in front of a computer, and there'd be a camera over their head focused at the keyboard, and a camera at their face, and a feed from the monitor. And that is where I learned to do write testing, which is rapid iterative testing and evaluation. So I did a lot of work with the people who were doing the actual design of systems and interfaces. And they would sit in the back behind this glass mirror, and I would go in and moderate a session And then I would, give the participant a questionnaire to fill out, and I'd go in the back and I'd talk to the engineers and designers in the back about what they'd seen, and they'd give me a list of questions that they wanted me to ask, and I'd go back into the room and talk. And then they would make some changes, and 2 days later, we do another set of sessions. So
I was just going to say, right? So streaming wasn't a thing yet. And unmoderated studies would come probably a decade later, become a thing. So most of the research that we are talking about is the traditional face-to-face interviews on site, so to speak. So if you had to interview someone on the other side of the US, you would basically have to either travel there or they would have to come over. And what about overseas studies? Because Intel at that time was already an international company.
Yeah. Yeah, actually, I had some partners who I worked with. I worked with a human factors engineer in Bangalore. So in Bangalore, they also had a lab. And so, we would talk to each other every morning, about what we had learned, and we would work it back and forth that way. But that was also, at the time when the famous lab in a bag came out. So you still had to travel, but there was a company, I can't remember who they were, but they put together basically like a portable user experience lab that you could wheel around with you in this big honking suitcase. So
I can imagine you getting through the airport with that lab in a bag.
Exactly. And you had to, yes. So that was super rad, that was like, oh yeah, I'm a mobile researcher and I'm out in the field with this enormous suitcase that I'm lugging around with me and, setting up, a test situation in a conference room type of thing.
I think people don't comprehend how complicated everything you have just mentioned is. Because even until 2006, 2008, when I was in Canada and I had to call home, I would still have to go to the post office, buy those phone cards. They were extremely expensive. So to think about someone just talking to another researcher out of Bangalore in the morning before the studies, that's an operation by itself. And probably very few companies could afford it that time.
Yeah, exactly. It was super expensive and clunky. It was just very, very clunky. And, the quality of the interviews suffered because of that. It was actually very weird. I mean, sometimes you'd be in a conference room with this lab in the bag and you'd be at one end of the table with your participant and there would be 5 people like at the other end of the conference room table, taking notes and staring. And the participant would kind of be like, oh, it was just very clunky. It was clunky, but we learned a lot of cool stuff.
JB, how does one go from a portable lab in a bag working at Intel to researching agents in ServiceTitan?
Yeah, it's a long, that's a long history. So that was 20 years ago that I was at Intel. So in between that time, I've worked a number of different places. When I really put the stake in the ground to be a researcher, I spent quite a bit of time working in e-commerce. So I worked for Columbia Sportswear, for their e-commerce, platform for a long time. So I was in, the e-commerce realm. I left software, and went into e-commerce for a while. And then I got this opportunity to, go work for Shopify in Canada. And that is really the first time that I took the, I think that I took the title of researcher, right? So before then I'd been, a user experience architect or an interaction designer or human factors engineer, and sort of did a little bit of everything. It was like a generalist type of role. But when I went to Shopify, I went there as a researcher, and I was very excited to do that because Shopify had a very large research team at the time. There were like 50 researchers in the company. And that is where I really got to, I say like grow my T, as a T-shaped user experience person, where I really got to learn from some really amazing professional researchers who, actually had PhDs in it, and really kind of refine my approach as a researcher.
Anyone in particular that you would like to call out there if they're listening to the podcast?
Oh my goodness. I would say a couple of first names. I would say Alona. I would say Gabe. I would say Jeremy. Those are a few people who I would give a good shout out to.
It sounds like a super interesting period at Shopify. I can't remember how big Shopify was, but having a research team of 50, that's definitely impressive. And I guess we're talking about kind of this transition period from physical to digital, e-commerce becoming a thing. And so I can see why Shopify would double down on research kind of to build the rules, to figure out how to do things. And to be honest, I believe that over the years, Shopify was very well known for its frictionless experience and UI and kind of really catering to their users. I know that the talk in the Valley is that many companies are still trying to copy the Shopify playbook and how to do things. So you had a chance to contribute to that. So before we kind of maybe shift gears and talk a bit about your current research stack, one thing I wanted to ask you in the context of the past, what is maybe one interview that you conducted that you will never forget? An interview that was so mind-blowing that you just remember it crystal clear as if it just happened yesterday.
Yeah, I'm going to go back to a time when I was working on a project for freight forwarding. So I was working with a company that was transitioning from tracking the 24-hour freight life cycle on paper to digital tracking. And as part of this, I was working with the mobile experience team, and we were building a handheld device that people who drove trucks and people who worked on the loading docks would use to scan the freight and track it through the system. And so I was out in the field. I was in Newark, New Jersey. I was working the 24-hour shift on a loading dock with, 200 doors, 100 on one side for inbound freight and 100 on the other side for outbound freight. And I was in the break room and I was interviewing dock workers during their break to talk to them about their experience using this new handheld device because they were they were prototyping it for us, right? Or beta testing it for us. And so I was sitting in the break room, waiting for the first forklift driver to come in. So these guys, they drove forklifts and they would go on the inbound side and they get a pile of boxes off of a truck and they'd forklift them across the loading dock to the outbound side and load them onto a truck. And their job was to scan the freight as it came off the truck. And then they would have to scan it before it went on to the other truck. Because, the company wanted to know that it was offloaded and then how long it took to get it onto the right truck and then to confirm that it was unloaded. And so the first person came into the break room and they had these Motorola, big ass devices, and they had it duct taped to like a 6-foot broomstick. And I was shocked. I was like, oh, what are you doing? Like, why do you have the thing duct taped to the broomstick? And the person told me that OSHA required them to wear seatbelts when they were on the forklifts, and that they used to just have a clipboard with paper hanging from their forklift, and they could just, check everything off on the clipboard. But now that they had to use these devices, which they hated, they had to actually undo their seatbelt, get off the forklift, walk over to the door, scan everything, scan the door, get back onto the forklift, put their seatbelt on, drive across the dock, and do it all over again. And that these things were actually making their life miserable. So they had this hack where they could push the buttons real quick and like hold the device on this broomstick up to the scanner to get it across. So I will never forget that, because that is real human experience with some great idea that, the business and engineering had, which was absolutely not working for them.
I can just imagine the look on your face when you see that and you're like, what is going on here?
It was, yeah, exactly. Because these were like these beautiful things that we took so much pride in. Like it was wrapped in big, ugly silver duct tape to the end of a broomstick.
Love it. Love it.
And when I took those pictures back to the engineering team, everybody was like, oh.
This is definitely not something you could have come across if you were to kind of run those interviews on Zoom, say, for example. No. So we went from a lab in a bag to loading docks to agentic experiences.
Yeah.
So shifting gears slightly here, I think we won't have enough time to talk about your kind of research tooling throughout all the different generations and periods. But I do want us to spend a few minutes talking about your current stack.
Yeah.
Researchers out there, I know that they're always looking for new tooling. They're always looking for new hacks. And AI is extremely exciting, right? Because there are so many new tools coming out there. And so I would be curious to hear about 3-4 tools that are part of your research stack, or take us through that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, AI, of course, plays heavily into the research stack now. I would say that, I think the tool that I've been sort of building up and cultivating the most over the past, let's say 18 months is OpenAI, ChatGPT in an enterprise team environment where I can, I've built a bunch of GPTs and a bunch of project folders that are really, really smart and help me as a researcher. That has like literally, 10x'd my, productivity as a researcher and the, productivity of my team as a researcher, because, AI is very, very fast at reading and writing. So that it takes a huge burden, off of people. So that's one thing in the stack. Absolutely, research repository is another thing in the stack, because your research is not at all valuable if you can't share it throughout the organization. So being able to, capture, tag, and share research in a central repository is critical. So the research repository is something that we rely on very heavily. Another thing that we use is we've built our own research impact tracker. So as a team, as somebody, I'm responsible for the research organization. I'm responsible for talking about the impact research has for the business. So we have built our own impact tracker that allows us to, track that through a number of different dimensions and, share that impact out with the organization. Some other tools that we have, we rely super heavily on unmoderated usability testing tool. Both in any of the work we do with consumers and then because we're a SaaS company, our own customers. And we manage those tools. When I first came on board about 4 years ago, the research team was running them. Now we're enabling anybody who wants to test a prototype to use those tools. And that is a really great way to do, very tactical, both evaluative and exploratory work. So that's super important for us. And then, we are piloting Genway right now. I'm very excited about that because our customers are inundated with requests to do research and have interviews with people, and they don't have a lot of time. And so we're starting to experiment with using your tool to help us get quick 10-minute interviews with customers to help us do a lot of what I talked about way back in the day, earlier in a career, where you would do maybe a survey and then you'd get some qualitative insight into that survey. People don't like to type, but they can talk for 10 minutes, right? So right now we're running a couple of experiments where we've sent out surveys. We've asked people if they'd be willing to talk to us for a couple of minutes, and we're sending them a link to do a 10-minute interview to follow up on what they said with the survey. So those are our, I would say that's our major set of tools that we're using right now.
So the research impact tracker, that's definitely something that many folks out there would be interested at. So you might get a lot of inbound for that. I know that it's a real challenge for many teams. How do you track impact? How do you communicate impact across kind of stakeholders and across different orgs within the company? So kudos for that. In the context of using AI, as you have mentioned, Genway, I'm wondering, what are your thoughts about the future of research when it comes to AI moderation? Do you see that becoming a more prominent part of research? Do you see it becoming just another tool in the research kit? Or whether that's still kind of TBD, to be decided or to be explored?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. It is, I think it's to be decided and to be explored. And, this leans a little bit into my very, very new, addition to my title, agent experience, right? So you have built a bunch of agents. We at ServiceTitan are working on agents. So I've been doing a little, research in that area. And, the agent experience part of my role is really kind of, focusing on the interactions between these AI agents and human beings, and what that's all about. I will say one thing that I've learned, in the consumer realm, because we're building some agents right now that are focused on, basically, helping consumers, get a service provider out to their house faster. I'm doing a lot of research with consumers and getting feedback from them about their experience dealing or talking to an AI agent. And interestingly, I'm starting to hear people say that they'd rather talk to AI than a human being. And I'm not really sure what that means, but I think it means something. So I'm going to hold off on thinking about what that means, but I think there's some emergent comfort with, speaking with AI instead of a human being. And I think that could have benefits in the research arena. You asked me about studies that I've done in the past. When I was at Shopify, I was in the financial services area, and I talked to small and medium business owners about how they manage their cash flow. And that was very sensitive and emotional for many of the people I talked to, because you're asking them to really be vulnerable with you and tell you about their finances. And I kind of think if they could have talked to a non-human, they might have been a little bit more open in some cases. So I don't know if I went off the rails there, but
no, it's a good observation. I was having this conversation a couple of weeks ago while hailing a Waymo in San Francisco, and I think it's a very good comparison to an extent. Maybe the experience of hailing a Waymo is very intuitive. The first 30 seconds, it feels a bit kind of weird and what is happening. There is no driver. Mm-hmm. But then within 30 seconds, you find yourself fully immersed in this experience. And I have been chatting to a few folks, asking them whether they would feel comfortable sending their kids after midnight in an Uber or a Waymo. And surprisingly, most of them said that during the late kind of night hours, they would feel more comfortable with a Waymo. And that brings me up to this thought about the fact that as a humanity, we put more trust into machines than other humans, which is by itself is a bit of a sad kind of notion, so to speak, or concerning notion. But there is definitely something there, and time would say how that should kind of evolve or how that should be done, I guess.
Natan, that is really, that's, wow. Yeah, that's fascinating.
JB, moving forward, because I want us also to discuss a bit more about the future of research. Mm-hmm. What advice would you give to students or kind of early career researchers that are entering the space today or considering to enter the space today? I know that there is a lot of talking around roles for juniors and whether AI is going to take away that part, or maybe AI is going to replace the older folks that have been around for many years and maybe did not kind of adjust to the AI age. So what advice and what are your thoughts around folks that are at the beginning of their career, pursuing a career in UX research or just about to start one?
Yeah, well, you mentioned, I think when we were talking about my stack, you perked up at the impact tracker, right? So, when you're entering into a career, and I give this advice to everyone, people on my team. I think sometimes researchers, we're dreamy, we're intellectual, we're super curious. It's easy for us to get sidetracked by some, super interesting tidbit and maybe even go down a rabbit hole, because it's just fascinating, but it maybe isn't impactful or valuable to the business. So a piece of advice that I give people all the time, and I have these talks with myself as well, is, where is the impact to the business? Where is the value to the business? So, as a researcher, always, focused on, bringing value. So that means, partnering with your product management, partnering with the people who own the business results, partnering with engineers, partnering with designers to understand, how you can help them frame questions that are answering is going to have the most impact for the business. So that's a big piece of advice, and I think the most important piece of advice, because even as somebody early in your career coming in, if you can, demonstrate to people that you're business focused and that you, the value that you are bringing as a researcher is that you can help, coalesce a team around a set of questions that is going to be, very, very impactful and valuable to the success of the project, then you're going to be a trusted asset in that organization. So that, I think that's the most important thing.
JB, do you think that the qualities that defined a good researcher pre-AI era and post-AI era, are those the same, or do you think that they are fundamentally changing?
That's a good question. I think when I think about the AI area, the AI emergence, I think a lot about that period of time when we were transitioning from drafting by hand to drafting with the computer. I entered a competition in 1989, and it was at the Southeastern Theater Conference, and I entered a lighting design that I had drafted with CAD into a competition. And the judges in the competition, during my critique, there was a judge in the competition who said, you used a computer to do your design work for you. And they wanted to disqualify me from the competition. And I said, drawing a light plot is not the design. It is the map for the electricians to know where to put the lighting instruments. I did the design and I used the computer to do it faster so that I could spend more time focusing on the aesthetic. And I feel a lot like the same way about AI, right? So it's really kind of knowing where to drop your attachment to things, right? Like, if you really are attached to writing the most beautiful research report, maybe you need to drop that attachment, because guess what? AI can probably, write a report that's more scannable and readable by people, or something else, right? So I think that it's more of a willingness to sort of flex, lose your attachment to the way you work now and be open to, really kind of leaning on tools that do things maybe better or faster than you can, and then developing yourself in other areas, because that's what the the joy of using AI is for me, is like I can drop a lot of things. I can do more projects. I can think more creatively about things. So I think that's what AI is bringing us. It's bringing us some freedom in a sense. I mean, now you couldn't, like a lighting designer would be, what is a drafting table? Right.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned CAD that, well, I heard about it from my theater background, but most of the people are probably not even familiar with that. Noam Siegel, a friend of the show, I believe he coined the term hybrid operator.
Oh,
and I
yeah.
feel that a lot of the things that you just mentioned resonate with that. The age of hybrid operators, being able to zoom in and out depending on the task in question, depending on the priorities, getting the machine to do the things that it is good at, and yourself doing things that you're good at. During my years at Google, I always asked myself how success looks like. Does success look like getting 10, 20, 30 more interviews? Or is that more about the impact that is derived out of those interviews? So there are a bunch of questions there that are yet to be answered. And as we speak, there is this brilliant book that I read probably 2 decades ago. I can't remember the author, but the title stayed with me, A Global Citizen. The opening quote for the book is, "Give up on everything that makes you special, and you will gain a whole new world."
Wow. Yeah.
And I feel that that's a very kind of appropriate quote, especially in this time of rapid change, when we're shifting from one technology to another, when we might be shifting jobs much faster than before, when we relocate from one place to another. Being open to those new experiences would ultimately define our future trajectory. JB, thank you so much for taking the time to chat to me today. Before we finish the podcast, there is one last question that I would love to ask you. If you were not a UX researcher, what alternative career path you would have chosen?
Well, that's actually probably in my cards for semi-retirement. And that career is senior dog rescuer.
Senior dog rescuer.
Yes, senior dog rescuer. I'm actually passionate about rescue dogs and have done some volunteer work in that area. But a couple of years ago, learned about senior dogs who don't get adopted so much. And I have one right now who's sitting over there waiting for breakfast. And there's nothing more joyful to me than giving a senior dog a really great couple of golden years. So that's if I could do that full time, that's what I would be doing.
JB, thank you so much for spending the time with us today. Appreciate your insights, and hopefully we're not going to keep the senior dog waiting too long for his breakfast. Thank you so much, and I look forward for hosting you again at some point.
Absolutely. Thank you, Natan. This was a great experience.